Morning. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank Georgia Bio for giving us the opportunity and platform to speak to you this morning. And thank each of you so very much for taking the time to join us for this breakout session on the continuation of clinical research study activities through the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Steve Ash, and I'm Vice President of Clinical Operations at Peachtree Bioresearch Solutions. And I'm very proud to say that Peachtree Bioresearch is a highly successful woman-owned full-service CRO that has been in business since 2008 with headquarters located in Atlanta, Georgia. I personally have over 22 years of clinical trial industry experience, including experience on the investigator site, CRO, and sponsor sides of research, with over 15 years of global project and site management. And I'm happy to say that joining me on the panel today are Dr. Sarah Cosmi from the Atlanta Center for Medical Research. Dr. Cosmi, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Steve. As mentioned, my name is Sarah Cosmi. I am the Vice President and General Manager of Atlanta Center for Medical Research. We are a private clinical research site here in Southwest Atlanta, where we conduct CNS trials, primarily in psychiatry and neurology. I have over 10 years of experience, starting from coordinating studies to then managing multi-site, complex global trials within the industry. And I look forward to having a great discussion here with everyone.
Great, thank you, Dr. Cosmi. And I'm also pleased to inform you that Amy Thorndike from Alira Health is also part of our panel today. Amy?
Yes, hi Steve, thank you. As Steve said, my name is Amy Thorndike. I work for Alira Health. We are a small CRO located west of Boston. I've been in the industry since 2004, and primarily my focus has always been in monitoring. I'm currently a lead CRA and also a CRA manager.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cosmi, and also Amy. So during this session, we are going to discuss several new clinical trial challenges that have presented as a result of COVID-19. We're also going to focus discussion on solutions that can and have been implemented to overcome those challenges. By the end of the session today, our hope is that you will see that despite the headwinds that presented earlier this year, that continuation of clinical trial conduct is indeed possible, including the start of new studies I'm very sorry. I just realized I was on mute. So during this session, we're going to discuss several new clinical trial challenges that have presented as a result of COVID-19. We're also going to focus discussion on solutions that can and have been implemented to overcome those challenges. And by the end of the session today, our hope is really that you will see that despite the headwinds that presented earlier this year, that continuation of clinical trial conduct is possible, including the start of new studies and the continuation of ongoing studies. Before we jump into our discussion on specific topics, it's important to remember and note that back on March 18th, the FDA very swiftly rolled out guidance on the conduct of clinical trials during COVID-19. The guidance was updated a few times. It was updated actually back in April, and then just recently again in September, and included a Q&A section, which was very helpful. And that guidance has been our roadmap and has helped direct our path to continuing operations through COVID-19 and identifying and implementing sound and innovative good clinical practice solutions. So as we talk today, please keep in mind as well that protecting participant safety, welfare, and rights is the priority and always remains the priority, is paramount, as well as have investigator site staff, CRO staff, sponsor staff, and other healthcare providers that are involved in research. Our focus is also on protecting the integrity and protecting integrity of trials and data, and maintaining compliance with good clinical practice. We're also focused on continuing our goal of delivery of new treatment options to patients while identifying sound solutions to continue those operations as normal as possible. And I'll acknowledge upfront that we understand that there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution. So as we discuss various topics today, hopefully they will help you think of different ways that you can start and continue your trials successfully. Okay, with that said, let's start off by discussing the COVID-19 impact that we have seen on clinical investigator site operations specifically, the challenges that they have experienced, and solutions that have been. So I'm just going to start off, and then I'll hand off to Dr. Cosme to provide her perspective from the site perspective. We've been faced with, as you know, a variety of challenges such as quarantines, site closures, reduced staff affecting all facets of research, travel limitations, interruptions in supply chain, patients unable to come into the clinic for routine visits, challenges that have presented difficulty in maintaining protocol specified visits and procedures, and including administration of investigational product or devices, and the conduct of safety and efficacy assessments such as laboratory or diagnostic testing or outcome assessments. Back in early March, when COVID-19 really began to impact the clinical trial industry, we began contacting our participating investigator sites to understand their position related to COVID-19 and found, as probably expected, a variety of scenarios that continue to evolve. And we continue to stay in very close communication with our participating sites to understand how their operations were evolving over time, and found that they did indeed evolve. So some sites stopped all research activity. Some diverted all staff to focus on managing COVID-19 response. Some have been working in shifts with limited staff, which limits staff availability, Some that had staff only working remotely from home and only going into clinic specifically for patient visits, or were only seeing patients remotely through video or telemedicine, or they weren't going into the clinic at all. But what we have found through it all is that there are many investigator sites that are very eager and able to continue clinical trial operations, and also patients that are interested in continuation of clinical trial participation. So with that said, Dr. Cosme, I'm going to hand over to you. If you can just go ahead and discuss how COVID-19 has impacted your site and processes that you may have implemented to overcome any challenges.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Steve, I think initially it was a little, as we were watching the CDC guidelines and what was going on in terms of the pandemic, we started paying very close attention to what the guidance was out there, albeit slightly uncertain at the time. But we, the main mantra in medicine is to do no harm. And so our primary focus was, how do we do that and keep the safety of our participants and our staff at the forefront? So we very quickly started to acquire PPE, which, as you know, initially was quite a task. We tried to reach out to local labs to see if we can do testing. And then we also looked at the types of studies that were ongoing, because many sponsors then took a back seat and decided we might need to pause our studies. And so it was important for us to provide that continuity of care for patients and participants in these trials. So we really worked very closely with sponsors to provide our social distancing measures that were taken at the site level. We spread out how visits would be done. Appointments were then spread out. We certainly had to look at staffing and adjust what that looked like because of the decrease in active enrolling studies, and then had to, manage our staff individually, study by study, because like you said, no study design is alike. It's not a one size fits all model that we could apply. And we have to work very closely with our CRO and CRAs to adjust monitoring, how data was going to be reviewed, because what was very important to us was maintaining the quality of data of those visits during this time. And so I'm sure Amy can speak a little bit on that. But we worked very closely with our partners to try to modify and make SOPs to allow for remote monitoring to continue that trial process. So I'm sure Amy would be able to provide a little input on that.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, there were definitely a lot of modifications that had to take place in terms of the monitoring piece. Primarily, as monitors, we all still go on site. There is some remote monitoring, but not like we've seen since the pandemic. So on our side, we started hearing from sites saying that, you know, even though they were going to continue the study, we couldn't come on site and monitor. And that actually started happening in early March. So even before we had gotten any guidance from the FDA, we started hearing from individual sites. And then probably in the second week of March, we realized quickly that we were going to pretty much hear from all of our sites. They were all going to tell us that we were no longer going to be allowed on site. So we had to quickly pivot and figure out, you know, how are we going to continue to monitor? How can we do remote monitoring? And one of the things that was important was really communicating individually with each site. And I'm sure you mentioned communicating with your CRA. Different sites have different capabilities. They have different setups. Some sites were already pretty well set up to transition to a remote monitoring model. Obviously, I think most of us work with EDC systems. So as monitors, we already do have remote access to the data. And then the difficult part is the source. So typically when we come on site, that's a large part of what we're doing is reviewing that source, whether we are within your EMR reviewing it or you're providing redacted source. So the source piece was what we had to work out with each site, and it was very site dependent based upon what their source was. Now there were sites that had EMR that allowed for remote EMR access. So you can imagine those were the easiest sites to really move forward. We scheduled some remote monitoring visits quite quickly for the sites that we had on-site visits scheduled in March, but needed to change to remote. And there were some sites we did remote visits in March. We very quickly transitioned to that. And then there were other sites who were a little bit unsure and needed a little bit of time. And we allowed that. So a few sites needed to kind of figure out, talk about it internally, look at their SOPs, and then got back to us in a few weeks. So the communication piece was really important to kind of keep that conversation going and following back up with sites, seeing if things have changed, have they identified a solution, and what's going to work best for them.
Right. And I think, you know, we were being on the site side with sponsors, with CROs, we have that constant communication. But from a site perspective, I think it's important that everyone has the visibility from the patient's perspective, because we're over here trying to figure out how to make, you know, our maintain the data quality. But at the same time, you know, keeping in mind what our participants were having to face was something, at least a nuance that from a site perspective, we had to learn how to adjust to. And so we really quickly implemented a lot of screening measures, questionnaires on the phone prior to them entering into the building. And what we did that was really helpful was identifying different areas of the building to do those segmented screenings. And so once a participant confirmed that they were all clear from, you know, the initial screening, they would then move on to a different piece. And we tried to limit the flow of, you know, the back and forth where a patient would normally come through. So if, a visit can have multiple different components where they travel, you know, from different parts of the building. And so we also limited that in an attempt to just decrease the high touch areas. So that was obviously, a challenge in the early stages, but I think we were able to implement such strict policies, which then were very clear cut and allowed for much like an assembly line structure to be developed.
That's right. Yeah. So important to limit that exposure and prevent introducing any new risk to patients coming into the clinic. Let's, if we can, quickly shift gears to talking about starting up new studies, and we'll get into much more depth on the various specifics on how to actually continue to see patients in trials and manage the data. But if we can shift quickly to studies and startup and really discussion on is it possible to start up a new study during the COVID-19 pandemic? And really, if you think about it, the first 3 or more months of a study are generally virtual anyway, as we work through site feasibility and the site startup process. And what we found was we were able to continue very successfully across multiple studies, the study startup activities, which included site feasibility, site selection, site startup, including collection of documents and contracts. We found that even though some clinic offices may have been closed or had reduced staff, that their staff were still working in some capacity, whether it be remotely or in the clinic. And even if we're working remotely, we're still able to receive feasibility responses, work on contracts and budgets, provide essential startup documents, and complete vendor and study trainings. So all that's traditionally done remotely anyway. So it's very much possible to continue to work through those steps. It also presents an opportunity, knowing the landscape and environment that we're in right now, which is has been the new normal. It's an opportunity to proactively design your protocols and think about building in flexibility to your protocols, such as phone or telemedicine or in-home visits, or even a hybrid approach to your protocol to avoid future protocol amendments. It's an opportunity as well to create and establish your study plans, such as your monitoring plan, to address the processes and strategies that you plan to implement to continue trial conduct through COVID-19. And also, if you think about it, a lot of time during startup is spent on getting vendor systems started up, building your EDC platform. That can take some time, and that can all be done remotely. So there's a lot that can still be done remotely behind the scenes before we actually get to activating a site and enrolling actual patients into the study. And as Dr. Kazmi and Amy were alluding to, there are many sites that have been willing to accommodate remote type work, remote phone or web type visits, such as site qualification visits. We've even had sites willing to accommodate FaceTime tours of their facility to give us the flavor and essence of a site qualification visit when we couldn't be there physically on site. So we've been able to really power through those challenges that have prevented us from being on site and more hands-on. That goes into as well the conduct of remote video site initiation visits. We've very successfully conducted web meetings, training meetings, and a few important considerations there as well to keep in mind is that you may not be able to catch all site staff or key site staff in one meeting, but you can break it up into different sessions to make sure that you are talking to the appropriate staff to complete a full initiation and thorough initiation visit of that site and training visit. And that may mean setting up separate time with the pharmacist at the site or the PI or the coordinator, depending on availability. So, just really maintaining flexibility and understanding we're living in a new normal, but we can still complete the work that we need to do to make sure appropriate training is conducted. And the use of electronic signature platforms has really been useful and helped us execute essential startup documents and really continue that flow of documentation electronically. And truly, it's a great opportunity to complete all of that activity and be ahead of the game and be ready to get your study kicked off. So I'll stop talking. Amy, Dr. Kazmi, anything you want to add there?
I don't think I have too much to add. I agree with everything you're saying, Steve. And I think we've also had this opportunity to kind of put our creative hats on in terms of navigating, figuring out, we always did it this way. We were always on site for SIVs, and how can we do it remotely? And I think we've also identified some efficiencies. Like you point out the fact that generally when we do an SIV, we go on site and we're trying to get everybody into a room at certain times, but they're all still working. They get called out of the room. And it's actually been nice to be able to say, you know what, I can call you in an hour. If this isn't a good time, you know, it's the SIV, you get it all done, but you may get it done over a couple of days, which is totally fine. And it's even that much more convenient for the staff who are attending, that flexibility is now available.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, although our method of operations has changed, I would say certainly everyone from a site and, CROs, they've all tried so hard to be available that actually communication is probably better now than ever, because we're also readily available and wanting to ensure that if someone is trying to reach out, whether it be from the site to the sponsor, CRO, or vice versa, we're making that time. And it might not always be in, chunks of time, like you said, where we're slotting out 4 hours, but communication is key. And I think that's still very much there. We've had to do, like you mentioned, Steve, the, FaceTime video tours of our clinic. We've had many different meetings with, during the startup phase. And so I think all of that has allowed a pretty smooth startup for majority of the sites running trials.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Okay, so we've talked about site startup. We know it's possible, study startup. Let's now shift our gears to discussing how to start and continue patient screening and enrollment, and how various technologies or other service options out there can really help make that possible. So what we have seen in our continued outreach with sites is that some sites are still seeing patients in clinic with implemented participant and staff safety protocols in place. Others are only conducting remote patient evaluations. But the great news is that there were several technology solutions and also service options out there that were available to us pre-COVID, and other innovative ideas that have popped up post-COVID that have been and are being widely adopted in clinical trials now that have helped us progress with the conduct of trials. Some of those remote patient strategies include telemedicine, as we mentioned before, video and phone visit options. There are platforms such as, I think everybody's probably aware of, Zoom Health and Microsoft Teams, and even some site electronic medical or Epic systems, electronic medical record systems, have built-in telemedicine platforms that they can utilize. And of course, there's always FaceTime on your phone. So there are definitely ways around it to get FaceTime and a visual on patients, or at least continue that communication and complete all, if not as many, assessments as possible. Remote consent or e-consent options are out there and can certainly be utilized to continue patient screening. Thankfully, the FDA very kindly laid out several very detailed acceptable options for obtaining remote consent, even in situations where you may not be able to get a physical signature on the actual consent document. There are options out there for conducting remote consent in various capacities. One important consideration, of course, through all this to consider is whether it's necessary to provide participants with the required technology or device to ensure that they have access to those options that you plan to implement into your trial. If they don't have a phone or a tablet, some way for you to have a video connection with them, you may have to provide that type of device to your patients. So it's something you probably need to think about going into a trial when you're planning, or if you're shifting or pivoting in that direction to think about whether that might be necessary. Again, acknowledging here that this is an option, and these are options, but they may not work for all studies and all assessment types. So you really need to do, and the FDA actually recommends that you do a risk analysis for your individual study to make sure the options that you're going to implement actually work for your study and can maintain patient safety and data integrity. Another option that we've implemented in our trials that has been worked very well is home health nursing. So especially if you have a treatment that's administered by IV or that's not self-administered, or you have patient safety assessments that you'd like to continue and should continue, such as lab draws, ECGs, as examples, vital signs. Home health nursing options are a great idea and great option. They do carry their own liability insurance, so it's one thing you don't necessarily have to worry about. And in some of the providers that we've worked with, they actually have teams of nurses that are capable of administering some rating scale assessments as well in home. As I think Dr. Cosme mentioned earlier in our discussion as well, safety assessments that you'd like to continue to complete in your trial. They can be potentially completed at a local primary care practice or general practice that's local to your patient. Patients can potentially go to local laboratories to have lab draws, lab samples taken for your trial. If they can't come into a specific clinic, there are also mobile laboratory services out there that could be utilized. But of course, making sure that the source records from any of those evaluations or assessments do make it back to the actual investigator site. There are some performance outcome assessments and interview-based physician reported outcomes that may be possible to conduct remotely. It can be conducted by phone or through a video or telemedicine platform. There are also some very nice eCOA or ePro platforms out there that are available, very effective. And that's I'm getting back to setting up your study. It's something else you may want to consider. If you're going to include an ePro platform, you have time then to build that platform into your trial. And in those cases where you're conducting those assessments remotely, what we've seen many of our sites do, and what we've pushed is that we're not just setting up these systems. We're not just rolling out this technology. Sites are setting up time to actually meet with their patients to talk through how to use the devices, how to use the technology, how to complete the assessments, just as they would do if a patient came into clinic and they were explaining an assessment prior to a patient completing an evaluation or assessment. With that said, I do acknowledge that it may not be possible if a scale is not validated to be conducted remotely. May not be possible to administer all scales remotely, but there are some that can be. And certainly there are some rating scale assessments that require that you observe patient mannerisms and behaviors that may not be ideal to do remotely, but there are many that can be. But it is important to also keep in mind that clinical trials are often or sometimes the only healthcare option for many patients, and also can serve to relieve the burden or on other healthcare settings or providers that at this point may be not available or over capacity. So just some ideas to think about. Amy or Dr. Cosme, would you like to jump in and add anything there?
Yeah, I agree, with everything you're saying. It's all about continuing that communication and individually looking at each participant, what study they're necessarily in, like you mentioned, what the outcome measures are that we're really looking at in that specific study, to then determine what the best way to move forward would be. For some subjects, it's better to have them come in. They've developed a rapport with the site staff and we're able to better gauge how they're doing with certain interviews and assessments. At this time poses a little bit of stress and anxiety, I think, for everyone across the board. And so it's really important as an assessor at the site to be able to peel that away and understand what exactly is going on with each participant throughout the duration of the trial. So we've certainly had to adjust for that. So I think it's just a matter of taking it per study and per patient.
That's
Yeah,
right.
the only thing,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Amy.
the only thing Okay, the only thing I was gonna add is we found that in March and April, one of our heavy enrolling studies had a lot of patients in long-term follow-up, and with long-term follow-up visits every 3 months or so, but those visits really lent themselves well to telemedicine or phone calls. So a lot of sites did inquire and ask if they could do that, and we said absolutely, because they wanted to obviously minimize these patients coming into the hospital just for a long-term follow-up visit with assessments that could easily be done over the phone. And then there were some assessments that did get missed, but we're documenting all of that, and that's all being documented in, as per the FDA guidance and related to COVID-19. We did have one assessment where sites needed PPE to do it. So early on in March, sites were struggling to get PPE, so we were being notified that assessment was not being done, and of course we understood. So again, the communication piece and talking with the sites and what can you do, what can't you do, what limitations do you see, what modifications can you make, and then agreeing with them and giving them ideas and sharing ideas from other sites. Well, we know another site's doing this. Do you think this would work for you?
Right.
So. Yeah, really just kind of talking about that risk assessment is important. That was one of the things that we were concerned about in terms of our study is what can the site still do, what won't they be able to do, and what impact is that going to have. But we're really finding we've had minimal impact, and we've been able to move forward by being creative in talking with the sites and identifying solutions of problems or questions come up. So.
Yeah, it's really important, Amy. Really great point too. If you're shifting the way you're conducting your trial, if you're mending the way you're conducting your visits, moving from in-clinic to remote telemedicine, phone visits, any changes that you're making, the FDA does provide us with the allowance if it's protecting patient safety, and it's an effort to protect patient safety. For your clinical trial, you can pivot to a different process or a different way of doing things, but the really important thing to do is to document what you're doing, document everything you're doing, how things are being done, who's doing them, and also, traditionally we would send a protocol amendment to the IRB to get approval before we would implement any changes. The FDA has, in their guidance, has provided allowance for those changes to be made immediately if it's in the essence of protecting patient safety, and then those changes can be submitted to the IRB and FDA after they're implemented. But really, it's important to document what you're doing, why you're changing, and who's doing it and how.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been a lot of the work, is really figuring it out and then getting it all documented. Yep.
Yeah, having that flexibility is certainly nice. And not needing to wait, for all of the approvals necessarily that we would have had to do before we make any moves is certainly helpful. And like you mentioned, just the site staff, they have to be sure to just keep on file every decision, all the communication that's been made. And so far, it's been pretty easy to do so just because of everyone's availability and flexibility and willingness to all collectively think about what the best way to approach a situation is.
That's right. Yeah, one of the questions that we've had routinely pop up is how do we continue with investigational product supply or device supply or resupply? And there are various ways that you can get around that challenge if patients are not able to come into the clinic and receive medication as they traditionally may. So there are direct-to-patient options, shipping options that are in place. We actually work with multiple couriers that are very well-versed in the transport of clinical trial materials while also maintaining the appropriate temperature control and obtaining the transport documentation, including that chain of custody documentation that's so important to have. But they're able to deliver IP or investigation product to a patient directly, and then they can pick up used materials as well and return those to the investigator site. So just one option. We've seen some sites that have actually set up drive-through options in the parking lot of their clinic to reduce exposure so patients don't actually have to come in. to the clinic, and so to reduce that exposure, or sites that are actually having patients come in, but they have introduced additional safety protocols, again, to minimize exposure. As Dr. Kosmy mentioned before, just taking one path through the clinic to reduce exposure to various parts of the clinic.
Yeah, definitely. We have had transportation, like you said, draft up a process for the chain of custody to ensure the IP has been taken all the right precautionary measures, and then even drop that off to participants' house, made that delivery for them, and listed out how to take the instructions, do that via phone call. So that's been helpful early on.
Yes, yeah. For our sites that have been involved in having to ship medication, or we've actually had to ship directly to patients. Patients couldn't come into the clinic to actually get it. Our sites have been setting up time with those patients immediately following receipt of the product to talk through dosing instructions and guidance, and also storage condition instructions as well to the patients. So they're still getting the same flavor of instruction that they would get if they had actually come into that clinic.
Yeah.
If you're working on a trial that includes a medication that has been approved already by the FDA, one potential option as well is to have a local physician prescribe that medication so they can continue on that medication. So there are various options out there to supply or resupply what is needed for the continuation of a patient in a clinical trial. Okay, well, we'll transition now to then accessing patient source documents, conducting monitoring visits, and source data verification, review, and reporting. So for this one, Amy, I'll go ahead and hand over to you if you want to kick off this topic.
Sure. I spoke to it a little bit early on in our conversation. I think the most important thing that any CRO or sponsor needed to do early on was to identify the specific source that sites have available. So are you working with a site that's using EMR primarily? Are you working with a site that has paper source? And then identifying, how best can we get that source to the monitor. The easiest sites to transition to remote monitoring were those that were using an EMR platform that allowed for remote access. And actually, when we were in startup or in qualification, that was something we had asked. I don't know if we had a hunch, but it was information that we actually had for some of our sites, because we had been starting to ask that question when sites were telling us that they were using EMR. Typically we say, well, how does that EMR work when we're on site? Will we have access to it, or will we have to look over the shoulder? And a lot of EMRs now allow monitor access, but a step further is remote EMR access by the monitor. So we actually knew we had a few sites that we were going to be able to pivot to remote monitoring quite easily, because we knew they allowed for remote EMR access. So those sites we quickly reached out to and moved forward with getting those monitoring visits scheduled. And then we continue to talk to our other sites and just continue to identify, how are we going to make this work? How are you going to be able to provide source? We did go so far as to initially put a few sites on enrollment hold because they were unsure of how they were going to provide a source, and they did need some time to identify that. So we did put them on enrollment hold, but we generally followed up with them maybe once a week or every other week. I think at most at one point we maybe had 10 or 12 sites on hold as they were navigating how they were going to provide source remotely. But as each week went by, we were taking sites off that list. And I don't think we even have any sites left. So enough time has obviously gone on that all of the sites have been able to figure out a way to provide source. The redacted source piece is time consuming for the sites, and I think we mentioned before, a lot of our sites were short staffed, especially in March and April. They were being pulled in different directions. They were assisting with COVID-19 related patients in their hospitals. And so that some of the sites, it's taken a little bit longer to get the redacted source. Other sites, they're not on. Other sites, they have staff that are only on site certain days of the week, so really only have access to get it, redact it, and provide it to us limited days of the week. So, but we basically have identified how it's working at each site, and the sites that we know are short-staffed and or only have staff on site certain days of the week, we're patient. We give them a little bit more time to get the source together. Maybe we schedule their monitoring visits a little bit further apart. Maybe they're every 6 weeks because they just need more time. So again, it's all about the flexibility and talking with the sites about what they can and can't do, what they might be able to do in the future. Some sites were in the middle of changing over on EMR platforms. So we had a few sites who initially in March, they weren't going to be able to give us remote access, but they knew in either April or May, they were going to have a new EMR system that they were going to be able to provide us with remote access. So it has continued to evolve for some sites. And I think as time has gone on, it's gotten easier. And some sites have brought on new technologies. We have a lot of sites that use the Florence e-binder system that they give us remote access to that, so we have access to their trial master file or their investigator site file.
Yeah.
That's great. Yep. Sorry, Dr. Cosme, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like you mentioned, Amy, it's a lot of work for a site to redact a source. So I can imagine how much of a burden that is, but having the flexibility to then spread out those visits is helpful. We shifted to eReg about a year and a half ago or so. And so that was an additional point that was easier for us because we could then upload our source into the eReg platform and then grant our CRAs access, which made it a lot easier as well. So certainly I think everyone has always been, shifting to technology even prior to COVID. COVID just made us realize how much faster we have to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are a few other options too that we've seen and implemented as well, where remote EMR access may not be available, or there may not be eSource option in play. And there are multiple EDC platforms that we work with that actually have a source document upload and redaction tool built into the platform, which we found very helpful, where site staff can actually upload source documents, redacted source documents directly to the eCRF. So it's a secure platform. And they're also, it's also possible to create secure limited access folders on some cloud-based web platforms such as ShareFile or Box.com. Limited access, and sites can upload redacted source documents as well to those areas as an additional option where the other options may not be possible. So there are definitely options and solutions out there that can be implemented to get around this.
Definitely.
Okay, I would say too, and recommend that if you're in the process, of course, of starting a study and completing the feasibility process, I'd highly recommend that you build into any questionnaires or any outreach to investigator sites, questions related to their ability to accommodate remote monitoring visits or remote access to patient source. What do they use? What are they capable of using? Are they willing to use the new technology that might be out there that you may be implementing for your trial? So important to understand that up front. And as well to make sure that if sites are providing certified copies of source documents and uploading them to a source or an area, that they have a documented process for how they're ensuring that those are certified copies that they're providing to you. Okay, yeah, I think as some of the topics have kind of blended together, which was expected today, but as Amy was mentioning that regarding monitoring, there's definitely the possibility to complete many visit types remotely and very successfully. And again, like Amy mentioned, just being flexible with sites, understanding what their capabilities are, their staffing is, and being understanding there. But through the various platforms, we're able to progress through interim monitoring visits and still get access to patient source data, verify data quality and integrity, and also evaluate and oversee patient safety, which has been really nice. There are also some risk-based monitoring platforms or approaches out there that can be utilized to really target specific sites and data, or various metrics that you can focus in on, look at to focus your monitoring efforts on, such as enrollment, data queries, protocol deviations, things like that. So you can really focus that effort into areas where you might, during this time where you may not be able to get on site.
Right.
Yeah.
I think an important part to talk about or touch about on quickly is during the study startup process, we have so many forms of technology to move that process along. As we mentioned, a lot of these pieces could be done remotely from the very beginning. Now we're just getting more acclimated to doing so. But a point to note, I would say, is when you're looking to actually start enrollment in that study, how we're going to tweak the process in order to get patients into the building and then enrolled into these studies. And for a portion of it, we were really doing a lot of our pre-screening and initial conversations with the potential candidates over the phone in order to just limit all of that traffic coming in at once, because as Amy and you mentioned, Steve, a lot of the studies are now starting back up and in a fury, and how it always happens in our industry is it's either, strong and all together or none. And so being able to manage that from a site perspective is important, because we have multiple studies that are starting up with different therapeutic areas, and we want to be cautious from a site perspective not to have all of that traffic build back up, because that's one of the primary ways we were able to maintain those strict guidelines and prevent outbreaks within our staff and participants. So we've, like I said, done the remote and phone pre-screening more than we initially had, and then really trying to identify good quality candidates that really are interested in participating, and then bringing them in, so that way the ratio of the pre-screens and how many people you've interacted with and brought into the clinic versus those who actually qualified for screen is a better ratio, and that's really what we need during these times of so much going on with cases outside. So I think we've been able to successfully do that thus far, and I know that's a process that more sites are shifting to in order to maintain enrollment, have the activity there, but in the safest manner possible.
Yeah, that's right. No, great points, Dr. Cosme. Yeah. Good.
One thing I just want to bring up from a remote monitoring standpoint that I don't think we've touched upon, and I'm actually interested in hearing how this is going for Dr. Cosme, is drug accountability. So we have recently, basically when we modified our monitoring plan for remote monitoring, I don't think we expected it to go this long. So we were doing basically just a kind of a general drug accountability, where we were asking for drug accountability logs and then looking at the dosing of the patient and really just making sure those numbers lined up. But our sites have begun to accumulate used drug that they would like us to authorize for destruction, and we really wanted to see our product again. So typically we would go on site, we'd go to the pharmacy. So what we've been doing for that as a workaround for the sites that are allowing us to is we've actually been using a platform like Microsoft Teams, where the monitor and the pharmacist are together, and the pharmacist is actually showing us the kit. We can see the drug, we can count it, and stuff like that. And I'm just curious if you're doing something similar, or if you're doing something different for drug accountability.
We're doing a little bit of a hybrid, as you mentioned. I think originally, back in the spring, summertime, it was certainly more of the video conferencing and showing where each kit was and kind of having that, format. Now that we are back to having monitoring visits in the unblinded visits on site, where we have a separate area where they're able to go in and really take out all of the pieces that the monitor would have to look at ahead of time and have it laid out, so that way there's as less not interaction, but a decrease of steps in order to get the IP reviewed, do the compliance, do accountability, and keep it moving along.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's really important to you to communicate up front. Dr. Cosme, maybe you can appreciate this the most, but to communicate up front with site staff ahead of a visit to really let them know what the expectation and the plan is for that visit, what you plan to do. And what we've experienced in some cases, especially when it comes to electronic medical record, is that sites can only assign specific patients to a user's account. So they need to know in advance which patients you plan to review, so they know which patient records to assign to you during that specified time. So communication is definitely the key. I know we're at the end of our time. I can't believe 50 minutes went by so fast. But I just wanted to end by saying as well that it's important really to evaluate your company's SOPs to ensure that they allow the flexibility to implement the various strategies that you may be implementing into your trials. So take a look at those in advance. As well, evaluate your study plans and instructions to ensure that they clearly document strategies and processes that you plan to implement. And although the FDA does recognize that COVID-19 has impacted the conduct of clinical trials and has presented many new challenges, we're still required to protect patient safety, rights, and welfare, data quality, and ensure data integrity as well. So thank you so much, Amy. Thank you so much, Dr. Cosme. And thank you to everybody for joining today. I really appreciate you sticking with us and wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.